arms. The use of these weapons, the effects of which can be felt beyond the conflicts, is not compatible with the goals of disarmament. My country calls upon all parties to redouble their efforts to prevent the effects of a massive circulation of classic weapons, intensifying, and tracking and control needs to be intensified. The movement of these weapons is a breeding ground for insecurity and the resilience of terrorist groups. The trend to normalize the use of military force with a strengthening of a recourse to arms and weapons of mass destruction, and the massive rearmament and the increasing interest in nuclear deterrence by a number of countries is feeding into tensions and increasing the risks to peace and security in the world. We really need to reverse this worrying trend and reconnect with our organization, and in particular this council, with its primary vocation to protect present and future generations from the scourge of war. I would like to conclude by reiterating the constant appeal of my country to all of the parties, and particularly to regional and sub-regional organizations, to favor dialogue and negotiation in order to put an end to this conflict and achieve peaceful coexistence for all of the parties. Thank you. I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, President. And thank you, Deputy to the High Representative Ebo, for your briefing. Mr. President, we all know why Russia calls repeated meetings on this topic. 655 days since the start of its illegal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has failed to accomplish its war aims. It has failed to break the spirit and resistance of the Ukrainian people, and it has failed to mislead the international community, evidenced by the over 140 countries that have repeatedly and overwhelmingly condemned Russia's aggression and its humanitarian consequences. Over 140 member states have repeatedly urged Russia to stop its offensive and immediately, unconditionally, and completely withdraw all troops from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. We expect Russia to spout any justification it can, no matter how absurd, to mask its failures on the battlefield. Russia has tried to question the motives of the dozens of countries that have provided assistance to Ukraine, as well as Ukraine's right to self-defense as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia could end this war today. It can end its war crimes and atrocities against the people of Ukraine. It can cease its attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure. It can stop its forced deportation of Ukrainian children and return them to their families. It can withdraw its forces and start meeting its responsibilities as a permanent member of this council. Instead, Russia spends its time in this council criticizing legitimate assistance provided to defend Ukraine from Russia's illegal actions. Meanwhile, it is a fact Russia procured armaments for its aggression against Ukraine through channels expressly prohibited by the Security Council and its resolutions. Our information indicates the DPRK has provided Russia with more than 1,000 containers of military equipment and munitions, which will increase the human toll of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. In return for its support, the DPRK is seeking Russian military technology and assistance, including fighter aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, armed vehicles, ballistic missile production equipment and materials, and other technologies to advance its military capabilities and objectives. This expanding partnership, including technology transfers from Russia to the DPRK, undermines regional stability and the global non-proliferation regime. Russia and the DPRK must be held to account for actions undermining long-standing obligations under Security Council resolutions. At the same time, the Kremlin has turned to another regime unconcerned with human rights, international security, the global non-proliferation regime, or maintaining peace: Iran. Tehran has been providing Russia with guided aerial bombs and artillery ammunition, lethal equipment to end Ukrainian lives. We have provided clear evidence on the transfer of Iranian UAVs to Russia, which occurred while restrictions under Security Council Resolution 2231 prohibiting such transfers were in place. With DPRK and Iranian armaments, Russia can prolong its brutal war against Ukraine. Colleagues, it is the height of hypocrisy for Russia to claim before this very council that legitimate support for Ukraine's self-defense is prolonging the conflict, while it has repeatedly violated Security Council resolutions to fuel its war of aggression. These are resolutions Russia itself agreed to. We once again urge Russia to cease its aggression and withdraw from Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. And I thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Je remercie.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Mr. Ebo, the Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for his speech. I've also taken note of Marianne Wright's remarks. Today's meeting is yet another attempt by Russia to deflect from its responsibility for the war against Ukraine and its consequences. Once again, the narrative presented ignores the fact that the military aggression against Ukraine constitutes a grave violation of the UN Charter. Russia has not only attacked a member state, but also international law and multilateralism as a whole. There's no doubt as to who's the aggressor and who's the aggressed. As we reaffirmed during these 7 previous meetings on arms deliveries this year, Ukraine has the right, under the UN Charter, to ensure its security and defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. We reiterate that it is imperative to implement multilateral conventions and instruments on arms transfers effectively and comprehensively. All states have a responsibility to fulfill their obligations. In particular, the relevant resolutions of this Council, including Resolutions 1718, 2006 and 2231, 2015, must be respected. Efforts to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, always and still on the basis of the UN Charter, must be pursued. Switzerland is actively committed to this goal. To promote a peaceful settlement, we continue to urge Russia to cease all combat operations and withdraw all its troops from Ukrainian territory. Mr. President, the plight of civilians risks worsening with the onset of winter and continued attacks on vital infrastructure. This situation is particularly dangerous for children and other vulnerable people, including the elderly, sick and disabled. We again urge all parties to spare the civilian population and infrastructure and to facilitate the rapid, unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid throughout Ukraine. Alongside humanitarian aid, an inclusive and participatory reconstruction process must be supported. The clearance of mine-contaminated land is urgent and a precondition for the country's recovery. Furthermore, it is crucial that the damage caused by the war is recorded and that justice is done to the victims. The fight against impunity for the most serious crimes is a priority for Switzerland, and we support efforts to ensure accountability. This also applies to the perpetrators of crimes of aggression, who must answer for their actions. This is why Switzerland is committed to supporting the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Let me conclude by reiterating Russia's military aggression against Ukraine cannot be justified. I thank you.
de Suiza por su declaración.
I thank Switzerland for their statement and now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, President, for giving me the floor. I thank the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Adedeji Ebo, for his briefing, and also take note of the views expressed by Ms. Marianne Wright. My delegation concurs with the need for measures to avoid the possible proliferation and diversion of weapons from the war in Ukraine into other conflict areas, given the risk of escalation and the threat to peace and stability in many other fragile environments. We note the commitments expressed by the concerned states to take necessary steps, including the tracking of weapons designated for Ukraine, and urge sustained compliance with applicable non-proliferation measures in that regard. In reaffirming Ukraine's inherent right to self-defense under customary international law and deliberately codified in the Charter of the United Nations, we reiterate our call for an immediate end to the war and urge the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of the Russian Federation's troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. Mr. President, it is regrettable that after 22 months of sustained fighting across several front lines, a much-needed peaceful settlement continues to elude the parties to the detriment of innocent civilians. Thousands of lives have been lost, and many more livelihoods have been destroyed. Humanitarian conditions for vulnerable populations especially continue to worsen as the winter season comes on. We have stated in previous meetings and continue to believe that ending the war is an important step to upholding the fundamental principles of the international rules-based order and is most necessary to alleviate the burden borne by the ordinary people of Ukraine. It is also our view that the time to end the war is past due and there is no alternative to the peace in Ukraine. In that light, we reiterate our support for peace through the channels of diplomacy and dialogue. We encourage the international community not to be resigned to the emerging reality of a protracted war, but to intensify efforts aimed at bringing the parties together at the negotiating table. The warring parties must be impressed upon to resort to any or a combination of the models offered under Chapter 6 of the United Nations for the pacific settlement of disputes. It must also be emphasized that peace efforts in Ukraine should of necessity be guided by the principles of international law to ensure a just, comprehensive, and lasting solution. In closing, we wish to reiterate the several calls for the protection of civilians in line with obligations of the warring parties under international humanitarian law. We urge once more that requirements for distinction, proportionality, and military necessity are complied with to avoid causing harm to civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. I thank you, President.
Agradezco a la
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Deputy High Representative Ebo for his briefing. By calling for today's meeting, the Russian Federation seeks to paint a different picture based on an alternative reality. It hopes to divert the Security Council's focus away from Russia's aggression. It tries to rationalize the unjustifiable. It is yet another cynical attempt to present the aggressor as the victim and the victim as the aggressor. Yet again, we find ourselves recalling the facts. On 24 February 2022, the Russian Federation launched a full-scale invasion against its neighbor, Ukraine. In doing so, it violated its sovereignty and territorial integrity and brought war back to Europe. These actions also constituted a serious breach of the UN Charter and were a direct affront to international law and the multilateral system. Since then, more than 10,000 civilians have been killed, thousands more have been injured, and millions have been displaced. Another man-made humanitarian catastrophe that also seriously threatened and continues to threaten global food security. This dire situation persists, and it is having devastating consequences on Ukraine's population, especially during these cold winter months. The deaths, injuries, and level of destruction of civilian objects are staggering. Most civilian casualties continue to be caused by shelling and multiple launch rocket systems in areas near the front line by Russian armed forces. Adding to Russian missiles, drone attacks, and shelling, several reports have shed light on Russia's systematic use of landmines in Ukraine. These have resulted in more than 600 civilian casualties. Against this backdrop, we reiterate that Ukraine has the right to defend itself from this Russian aggression, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. It has the right to protect its citizens, its borders, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity, just like any other member of this organization. President, over the past weeks, we have seen another escalation in Russian attacks on populated areas across Ukraine, resulting in more civilian casualties. Furthermore, on Holodomor Remembrance Day, Russia launched one of its largest drone attacks since the beginning of its invasion, shelling Kiev and its surroundings for more than 6 hours. Many civilians were injured and over 12,000 households were left without electricity. We condemn such attacks unreservedly. All attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop immediately. They are prohibited under international humanitarian law and are completely unacceptable. President, wars have a disproportionate impact on women and children, and this one is no exception. Harrowing testimonies of rape and sexualized torture continue to be reported from Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian children face major disruptions in access to basic healthcare services and quality education, and continued grave violations of their rights, including forced deportations. We welcome the Ukraine's government's commitment to ending and preventing grave violations against children through the development of a prevention plan. We urge Russia to adopt and implement an action plan without further delay. Once again, we also urge Russia to end its hostilities and withdraw its military forces, equipment, and proxies from the entire internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. I thank you.
Agradezco a la...
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of France. Mr. President, I would like to thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. Russia complained last Wednesday when we were meeting to discuss the humanitarian situation in Ukraine of an excessive number of meetings that the Council had held on this matter. Also, the convening by Russia of the 11th meeting on the issue of arms transfers makes us wonder. Russia is making these meetings into a ritual and is persistently attempting to no avail to reverse the responsibility related to the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. The end to this war and the tragic consequences arising from it depends on Russia, who can put an end to this at any time without affecting its own security. The Russian missiles and the drones that Russia is acquiring continue to strike all of the Ukrainian territory. On the 25th of November, Kiev suffered the most significant attack since the beginning of the conflict. Since then, Russia has intensified its strikes on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And this morning, the Ukrainian capital was targeted by Russian missiles and drones. Russia is continuing, for now this has been the case for about 2 years, its war of aggression that it alone started in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, and which it has decided to continue despite repeated appeals of the General Assembly. If Russia puts an end to these strikes and if it withdraws its troops from Ukrainian territory as demanded by the International Court of Justice on the 16th of March 2022, then the war would come to an end. Mr. President, Russia is employing arms and munitions acquired from Iran and North Korea in violation of resolutions adopted by this Council. Moreover, Russia is employing irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, and it has announced the deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus. It has no compunction in undermining the multilateral system, international law, and efforts deployed for years now by this Council in the area of non-proliferation. France, together with its partners, has chosen to support the Ukrainian people in its right to legitimately defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, enshrined in Article 51 of the Charter. France will continue to assist Ukraine to put an end to the failing Russian aggression. It will continue to provide the necessary military equipment so that the Ukrainian people can defend themselves in the light of Russian strikes against their territory and critical infrastructure. What is at stake is international stability and security. Russia must not be allowed to win this war because force must not be allowed to prevail over the law, sovereignty and territorial integrity cannot be flouted with impunity. France will also continue to help Ukraine with regard to the humanitarian needs created by the Russian aggression. We will also pursue our support to the efforts of Ukraine and its partners to reduce the global food insecurity resulting from the Russian aggression. Mr. President, it is time for Russia to realize that our support for Ukraine will not falter and that there is only one possible outcome, a peace in line with the United Nations Charter, which respects the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank the briefers for their briefings. It is in no one's interest to prolong and complicate the Ukraine issue. Over the past year, the military spending of the countries concerned has increased dramatically to record levels. At the same time, more than 700 million people are threatened by hunger, and more than 700 million lack access to a basic necessity, drinking water. 2 billion people are facing various forms of economic hardship. Extensive inequalities, injustices, and other cases that defy reason still persist. Developing countries remain confronted with formidable obstacles on their journey toward the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development. We call on the countries concerned to focus more on these issues and channel their finite resources and efforts to more meaningful places. On the issue of war and peace, China's position is very clear. We always stand on the side of peace and dialogue. Be it the Ukraine issue or the Middle East, be it conflicts in Africa or the hotspot issues in the Asia-Pacific, we all hope that the flames of war can be quelled expeditiously and the disputes can be resolved through political means as soon as possible. The international community should adhere to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, advocate peaceful coexistence, and promote dialogue and reconciliation toward a world of lasting peace and common security. Thank you, President.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Deputy to the High Representative, Mr. Adedeji Ebo, and other briefer for their briefings. Mr. President, Russia has repeatedly requested Security Council meetings on the same topic in an attempt to distract the world's attention from the undeniable fact that it is Russia that started the unprovoked war of aggression. Russia should be concerned about what its own weapons are doing in Ukraine before worrying about international support for Ukraine to respond to Russia's aggression. Russia itself, the aggressor, should know very well why the international community is supporting Ukraine in the first place, including the provision of war arms. This is to assist Ukraine in exercising its right of self-defense from aggression. We would like to emphasize that the transaction in a violation of Security Council resolutions and the necessary support for Ukraine are completely different two things. Mr. President, no support should be given to a state that is violating international law and the UN Charter. It would be particularly unacceptable if support is rendered in violation of the existing Security Council resolutions. All member states should refrain from supporting Russia's aggression, either directly or indirectly. In this regard, as we released in the joint statement by Japan, ROK, US foreign ministers on 26 October, arms transfers from North Korea to Russia, several of which we have confirmed have been completed and which directly violate relevant Security Council resolutions, are absolutely unacceptable. They would not only exacerbate the situation in Ukraine, but also severely undermine the non-proliferation regime, which we all must value and uphold. In addition, we are deeply concerned about the potential for any transfer of nuclear or ballistic missile-related technology to North Korea, which would further threaten the peace and stability of the region as well as across the globe. We call on North Korea and Russia to abide by their obligations under all relevant Security Council resolutions and immediately cease all activities that violate them. Mr. President, threats by Russia of nuclear weapons use, nuclear weapon use, let alone any use of nuclear weapons by Russia in the context of its war of aggression against Ukraine are inadmissible. We join the deep regret expressed by the Secretary General for the decision by Russia on November 2nd this year to promulgate and put into force a law to revoke its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT. We reiterate that Japan deeply deplores this decision as it goes against the international community's long-standing efforts towards the entry into force and universalization of the treaty. As the only country to have suffered atomic bombings during the war, Japan is strongly committed to international efforts towards realizing a world without nuclear weapons. Bringing the CTBT into force is exactly for this purpose, and it must be achieved without further delay. Mr. President, it is Ukraine that is the country defending itself against an unprovoked aggression, which is a serious violation of the United Nations Charter. That is why we are repeatedly calling on Russia to withdraw immediately and unconditionally. Our steadfast commitment to supporting Ukraine's fight for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity will never waver. We take additional steps to support Ukrainians in their pursuit of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace that will uphold all the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, including respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty and the prohibition of the use of force. I thank you.
Le agradezco al
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank Mr. Adedeji Ebo for his briefing, as well as Ms. Marianne Wright for her remarks. Brazil reiterates its deep concern of the use of increasingly lethal and destructive weapons in the conflict in Ukraine. This disturbing trend, combined with the dangerous rhetoric of nuclear escalation, hinders the prospects of a peaceful resolution to the conflict and raises global concerns about threats to peace and security that go far beyond the countries directly affected by the conflict. As we stated many times previously, the increasing flow of weapons into the conflict zone jeopardizes collective security and peace efforts. The use of certain weapons is a cause of particular concern, such as the widespread deployment of landmines in vast areas in Ukraine. Additionally, the risk of weapons diversion to criminal and terrorist groups poses an alarming threat. This not only jeopardizes the immediate and future safety of the civilian population in Ukraine, but also presents a significant risk to peace and security. In addition, we urge all member states to adhere to the Arms Trade Treaty and to the UN Register of Conventional Arms, and underscore the importance of transparency in arms transactions and in the prevention of their diversion. Furthermore, the protection of civilian nuclear facilities in Ukraine is crucial and should be a priority for all parties to the conflict. Brazil reiterates its call for de-escalation and the start of negotiations, either directly or indirectly through third parties, in accordance with Article 33 of the UN Charter. Only through diplomatic negotiations, fueled by good political will, can we achieve a just and lasting peace in the Ukraine. Thank you.
Le agradezco al representante de Brasil por su declaración y tiene ahora la palabra.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
President, and thank you to Mr. Ebo and Ms. Wright for their briefings. Colleagues, this is the 7th time this year that Russia has called for a Security Council meeting on the supply of Western weapons to Ukraine. They've once again invited a Western briefer to support them. It's obvious what they're trying to do. These debates are clear evidence of a campaign to try to influence public opinion in the West, to undermine political support for Ukraine. A campaign driven by the Kremlin to serve the Kremlin's interests alone. This campaign is intended to help Russia to subjugate Ukraine and annex its territory, without Ukraine having the means to defend itself. but it is manifestly not in the interests of anyone else around this table to allow Russia, through violence, to violate and undermine the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that underpin the international order and that provide stability to our world. That is why we're proud to support Ukraine's right to self-defense, and that is why we will continue to supply Ukraine with the military assistance it needs for as long as it takes. This is all the more important when Russia itself is sourcing weapons from Iran and DPRK in violation of Security Council resolutions and using them to target civilians and Ukraine's critical national infrastructure. Colleagues, the Russian government is not only sending enormous volumes of weapons to Ukraine, it is also sacrificing the lives of more and more of its own citizens to prolong an invasion that is based on lies. A conveyor belt of Russian fathers and mothers, sons and daughters being sent to their deaths. Since Russia's invasion began, over 300,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded, many times more than in the 10 years of Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. President Putin now plans to conscript another 170,000 as cannon fodder for his government's war. It is hard to see how it is in the interests of the Russian people that the Russian government prolongs its aggression. It is certainly not in the interests of this Council that Russia succeeds. Let us not forget that for Russia, this is a war of choice. For Ukraine, it is a war of survival. We must therefore continue to give Ukraine all the support it needs to defend its sovereign territory. We must demonstrate our resolve to protect and uphold the UN Charter. And we must ensure that Ukraine secures a just and lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I will now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Ecuador. The delegation of Ecuador listened carefully to the informative briefings provided by Mr. Abdelji Ebo, Deputy to the High Representative of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, and Ms. Mary Ann Wright. And we would like to recognize the presence of the representative of Ukraine. We recognize the right of legitimate defense in accordance with the United Nations Charter. And we would insist that the Russian Federation put an end to its military aggression in order to make it possible for a ceasefire to move towards a just and lasting peace. Ecuador is also concerned about the risks posed by the inflow of arms and ammunition, and we support the recommendations of the Office for Disarmament Affairs outlined once again here today with regard to the measures that are necessary in order to mitigate these risks. We insist on the need to increase the standards for marking, registration and traceability of arms and ammunition, and to implement any measure aimed at preventing the diversion, spread and escalation of the conflict. Ecuador reiterates the need to give the highest priority to the protection of civilians and the goal of achieving global stability over and above any other arguments pertaining to industry, production or distribution. Finally, the supply of equipment and defense systems must help to protect the civilian infrastructure and protect the population. All supplies of arms and ammunition must be subject to sufficient guarantees, so that when they are used, the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution are respected. Likewise, any arm or munition which is not compatible with these principles should not be transferred or used. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Deputy to the High Representative, whom I'd like to thank for his briefing, I also recognize here Putin's representative in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Just 5 days ago, in this very chamber, this very delegate complained about the practice, I quote, to try to keep the Ukrainian issue afloat in the UN Security Council by any means, and for this purpose to gather us in this chamber from time to time. Nothing extraordinary has happened in Ukraine that requires an open meeting of the Security Council, also said this delegate at that Security Council meeting. The meeting, let me remind, where my delegation informed about the outrageous facts of execution by Russian troops of 2 Ukrainian prisoners of war, the killing of Ukrainian civilians, including the entire family, by Russian shellings, and the heavy missile and drone strikes across the entire Ukraine that occurred daily. Indeed, bringing death and destruction to other nations has never been something extraordinary for Russia. On the contrary, this is almost the only thing that Russia has always been eager to do. So what extraordinary has happened that the Russian delegation requested this meeting, and again, on tiresome issue of weapons? The fact that Ukrainians continue to resist and remain committed to restoring the sovereignty and territorial integrity of their state within its international recognized borders. Or it's due to the resilience of the Ukrainian city of Avdiivka, which continues to stand firm against relentless Russian attacks and inhumane bombardments that have destroyed both the city and the outskirts. Last week, the online media outlet Important Stories reported on an appeal written by more than 100 relatives of mobilized soldiers from the Russian military unit 95411. They claimed that Russian soldiers were intentionally being exterminated in near-suicidal meat assaults on Avdiivka, all in an effort to seize the city before December 14th. This is the date that the so-called direct lie with Putin is scheduled. It's an annual performance where Putin pretends to answer random questions from ordinary citizens. And naturally, announcement of any military victory would serve the purpose of this propaganda show. And the only chance, in Moscow's view, for the Russian troops to advance, along with throwing new and new cannon fodder to suicidal attacks across the entire front line, is to ensure Ukraine is running out of weaponry. Weaponry that Ukraine requires to defend itself and its citizens. From the first days of the Russian war of aggression, Ukrainian people have clearly realized what Russia's presence on the Ukrainian territory would mean for them. Lost lives, entire cities and villages reduced to rubble, extrajudicial executions, torture, persecution for expressing Ukrainian identity, stolen property, you name it. We reiterate, therefore, that we will continue to exercise our right to self-defense in strict accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, as long as the Russian troops remain on the territory of our country, as long as they persist in killing Ukrainians and terrorizing Ukraine with missile and drone strikes. We are grateful to our allies who continue to support our noble fight, in particular by supplying weapons. Weapons in the hands of soldiers defending their homes and their loved ones from the ruthless invasion should never be viewed as a factor of insecurity and deterioration. Is it deterioration that tonight our air defense was able to shoot down all 18 drones and 8 ballistic missiles that Russia launched on the Ukrainian capital? And we reject any hypocritical attempt to equate the responsibility of the party that defends itself on its own sovereign territory and the party that violates the UN Charter and persists in the unprovoked war of aggression. the only root cause of the enormous sufferings, high toll of casualties, destruction and environmental disaster throughout Ukraine and far beyond is the Russian unprovoked and full-scale invasion. As soon as it's over and the Russian troops withdraw from the entire Ukrainian territory, as soon as accountability for the most serious crimes under international law is ensured, the path to comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter will be open. This vision is embedded in both the UNGA Resolution ES 11/6 of 23 February 2023 and Ukraine's Peace Formula Plan. We urge the Security Council to concentrate its efforts on turning this vision to the reality. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Because it's very hard to keep connecting with other family members. My brothers and their families are also displaced in different areas